You thought it was love. The way they leaned in, the way they held your gaze, the way they made you feel like the only person in the room, it all felt sacred. But what you didn't realize is that your emotional energy wasn't a gift to them. It was a drug. And you? You were the high they couldn't quit. Today, we expose the brutal truth: narcissists aren't lovers. They're intimacy junkies, addicted not to you, but to the rush of consuming your presence, your vulnerability, your surrender. And once you see their addiction for what it is, you'll never confuse hunger for love again. Imagine this: you're lying there, feeling seen, cherished, finally safe. They whisper, "No one gets me like you do," or "I've never felt this close to anyone." But what you don't see is the machinery beneath the tenderness, the cold calculation that every touch, every sigh, every moment of closeness is designed not to bond, but to feed. Because to the narcissist, intimacy isn't connection. It's a hit. And your emotional energy is the substance they are chasing. Not out of love, but out of desperation. And you were the perfect dealer. Why does this wound cut so deep? Because it felt real. The eye contact wasn't faked. The urgency wasn't entirely staged. But none of it was about you. It was about access. Your empathy made you believe their performance was authenticity. Your kindness made you overlook red flags as passion. And your desire to be loved made you ignore the speed, the unnatural pace, the lack of real friendship, the absence of patience. You weren't fooled because you're weak. You were targeted because you're generous. And generosity is the currency addicts trade in. You thought physical closeness would deepen your bond. But for the narcissist, intimacy isn't about merging souls, it's about getting high. They don't crave your heart. They crave the neurochemical rush of your surrender, the dopamine of your attention, the oxytocin of your touch, the adrenaline of your emotional investment. And once they've had their fix, the warmth vanishes. The connection evaporates. Because the goal was never union, it was intoxication. And like any addict, they'll do anything to get the next hit, even if it means destroying the very source that sustains them. This isn't about attraction. It's about addiction. Narcissists scan rooms not for beauty, but for availability, emotional, energetic, and vulnerable. And empaths radiate availability like a beacon. You listen deeply. You hold space without judgment. You forgive quickly. To the intimacy junkie, that's not virtue, it's an open invitation. And once they're inside your orbit, they use your own compassion against you. Every time you soothe their ego after they've hurt you, every time you excuse their behavior, every time you offer your presence to reconnect, you're not healing them. You're feeding their habit. That chemistry you felt? It wasn't mutual magnetism. It was one-sided hunger disguised as destiny. They didn't connect with your soul. They studied your nervous system, what made you melt, what made you yield, what made you forget your boundaries. And in moments of vulnerability, they struck. Not with aggression, but with precision. A tear at the right moment, a confession that mirrored your pain, a touch that felt like home. And you, in your empathy, mistook their performance for healing. But healing doesn't leave you emptier. It fills you. Addiction drains. You weren't wrong to trust. You were right to believe in goodness. But the intimacy junkie doesn't operate in goodness. They operate in extraction. And your emotional energy became the easiest resource to mine, because you gave it freely, believing it would build something real. But real things don't collapse the moment you set a boundary. Real things don't punish you for asking for consistency. What you had wasn't love. It was a transaction dressed in silk, sold to you as a covenant. And the price you paid wasn't just your energy, it was your belief in your own worth. This video isn't here to shame you for still hurting. It's here to reframe your pain as proof, not of your weakness, but of their pathology. Your body responded because you're human. Your heart believed because you're wired for connection. But their behavior? That wasn't love. That was predation wrapped in tenderness. And understanding that isn't excuse-making. It's awakening. Because once you see the machinery behind the magic, the calculated timing, the mirrored vulnerability, the strategic intimacy, you stop blaming yourself for being used. The most dangerous lie they sold you? That your empathy was the problem. But your empathy wasn't the flaw, their exploitation of it was. You weren't too giving. You were giving to someone who only knows how to take. And intimacy became the stage where your generosity was turned into compliance. They didn't want your love. They wanted your surrender as proof they still mattered. And your empathy made that surrender feel noble. But nobility doesn't belong in a trap. And now that you see it, you can never be caught in it again. So let's pull back the curtain on the ultimate deception, why narcissists hunt empaths for intimacy, and how they use your emotional energy not to bond, but to get high. Because once you understand the blueprint of their addiction, the way they weaponize your kindness, mimic your pain, and turn your presence into a validation tool, you'll stop seeing yourself as broken. You'll see yourself as brilliant for surviving a game you never knew you were playing. At the core of the narcissist's addiction is a biological truth they can't escape. Their brain is wired like a junkie's, not for love, but for supply. Every time you offer your emotional energy, your attention, your empathy, your physical presence, their nervous system registers it as a hit of dopamine. Not because they love you, but because they've successfully extracted validation. And like any addict, they'll do anything to get the next fix, even if it means destroying the very source that sustains them. Your light isn't admired. It's metabolized. And once it's gone, they'll move on to the next empath, leaving you wondering why you feel so empty. Their entire identity is built on external validation, and intimacy is their most potent delivery system. They don't seek closeness to connect, they seek it to confirm they still exist. Your calm becomes their stability. Your joy becomes their proof of desirability. Your vulnerability becomes their emotional life support. And because empaths radiate warmth like a beacon in the dark, they're the perfect targets. Not because they are weak, but because they are generous. And generosity, in the hands of an addict, is not a virtue, it's a vulnerability waiting to be exploited. This is why they panic when you dim your light, even slightly. A cancelled call. A delayed reply. A quiet evening alone. To you, it's self-care. To them, it's withdrawal. Because your energy isn't just comforting, it's essential. Without it, their false self begins to crack. The mask slips. The performance falters. And for the first time, they feel the terrifying void beneath the grandiosity. So they hoover. They guilt. They rage. Not because they miss you, but because the power goes out. You're not their soulmate. You're their supply. And supply runs out. They've learned that empaths respond to pain with closeness. So they manufacture pain, tears over past trauma, trembling voices about feeling unworthy, dramatic confessions designed to trigger your compassion. But this isn't healing. It's bait. And you, in your empathy, lean in, offering your emotional energy as a balm. But there are no wounds to heal. Only hunger to feed. And your light becomes the fuel that keeps their illusion alive. You're not healing them. You're enabling their escape from themselves. Your emotional energy doesn't guide them toward growth. It shields them from consequence. Every time you absorb their chaos, you prevent them from hitting the wall that might finally force change. Every time you explain away their behavior, you reinforce their belief that they don't need to evolve. And every time you return after they've discarded you, you teach them that your energy is unconditional, and therefore, disposable. Real love holds people accountable. What you're offering isn't love. It's permission to keep using. Internally, they are terrified of your independence. Because if you can thrive without them, then their entire narrative collapses. They've convinced themselves, and you, that you need them to feel seen, valued, or loved. But the moment you prove you don't, that you can be whole, calm, and radiant on your own, their power evaporates. And that's why they work so hard to keep you dimmed, tired, confused, doubting yourself. A weakened empath is a reliable source. A healed one? Uncontrollable. They cannot tolerate a light they can't control. So they'll try to dim you, through criticism disguised as concern, through comparison, through gaslighting your joy as naivety. If they can't consume your energy, they'll try to extinguish it. Because a bright, sovereign empath exposes their emptiness by contrast. Your peace highlights their chaos. Your clarity reveals their distortion. And your refusal to perform admiration? That's the ultimate threat. Not because you're attacking them, but because you're no longer feeding the lie. This cycle repeats not because you keep falling for it, but because the narcissist keeps using the same playbook on every empath they meet. They don't change. They can't. Their behavior isn't about you. It's about their internal void. And no amount of your emotional energy will fill it. The more you give, the hungrier they become, not because you're failing, but because consumption is their only language. And until you stop speaking it, they'll keep taking. Their addiction isn't to you. It's to the feeling you give them, the illusion of being whole, desired, powerful. But that feeling is fleeting. So they must chase it again. And again. With new empaths, new performances, new lies. They don't want partnership. They want a pipeline. And you were just the latest in a long line of sources they've drained dry. Not because you weren't special, but because to an addict, everyone is temporary. Everyone is replaceable. Everyone is a means to a high. So remember, your emotional energy is not a public utility. It's a sacred flame meant to illuminate your path, not to warm those who refuse to build their own fire. Protecting it isn't selfish. It's survival. And the moment you stop giving your energy to those who treat it as a right, you reclaim the one thing they can never take, your sovereignty. The turning point doesn't arrive with a fight or a dramatic exit. It arrives in the quietest moment of all, the day you stop offering your emotional energy to someone who only knows how to take. You don't yell. You don't explain. You simply pull your presence back, fully, finally, without apology. And in that withdrawal, something seismic shifts. Not because you've changed them, but because you've stopped feeding their addiction. Your absence isn't abandonment. It's accountability. And accountability is the one thing their entire identity was built to avoid. Watch how quickly their love curdles into punishment when they realize your energy is no longer available. One day they're calling you my healer, the next they're coldly accusing you of being selfish or cold. Why? Because you disrupted the script. You stopped playing the role of the eternal giver and became a person with limits. And limits threaten the illusion of control. So they retaliate, not with honesty, but with withdrawal, blame, or sudden indifference, anything to restore the imbalance that once fed their ego. Their rage isn't about your boundary. It's about their loss of access to your high. They'll gaslight you into believing your self-protection is cruelty. Your need for peace is rejection. Your refusal to soothe their chaos is proof you've changed. All while they continue to expect your presence, your attention, your emotional labor, as if your energy is theirs by right. But here's the truth they can't admit. They don't want partnership. They want performance. And when you stop performing, they panic. Because without your glow, their darkness is exposed, and they'd rather destroy you than face it. This is the psychological plot twist they never see coming. Their downfall isn't caused by your anger or your departure. It's caused by your stillness. The moment you stop using your emotional energy to mask their emptiness, they are forced to confront the raw truth. They were never whole. They were only ever borrowing your wholeness to pretend they mattered. And without that borrowed light, they're left with nothing but the hollow echo of their own irrelevance. That's not your failure. That's their reckoning. They'll hoover you with sudden bursts of vulnerability, a late-night message saying, "I can't sleep without your calm," or "You're the only one who understands me." But don't mistake this for growth. It's recalibration. They're testing whether your energy is still on offer. This isn't healing. It's supply maintenance. And you're not being invited back into their heart, you're being summoned as their emotional subject, their validation source, their temporary fix. They don't miss you. They miss what you gave them, proof they still exist. Don't confuse their panic for remorse. Their fear isn't about hurting you, it's about losing access to your energy. You're not a person to them in that moment. You're a resource they're scrambling to reclaim before their inner world collapses completely. And the more you resist, the more erratic they become, love-bombing, smearing you to friends, triangulating with others, because your absence isn't just silence. It's proof that their performance isn't enough to keep you tethered. And that proof is unbearable. This is where real power shifts, not with a shout, but with finality. The day you stop hoping they'll finally see your worth. The day you realize your emotional energy doesn't require their approval to shine. You don't have to explain why you protect your energy. You simply live as if it's sacred. And in that living, you become untouchable. Because a self-possessed you cannot be manipulated. A grounded you cannot be guilt. And a silent you, no longer performing admiration, forces them to hear the one sound they've spent a lifetime drowning out, the hollow echo of their own emptiness. They'll rage. They'll tell mutual friends you became selfish or lost your compassion. They'll paint themselves as the victim of your coldness. But projection is their last defense. Because deep down, beneath the bluster and the blame, they know the truth, they didn't lose you. They lost the version of you that tolerated their hunger. And that version is gone, not because you hardened your heart, but because you finally honored your soul. Your calm departure is the first honest thing you've ever given them, and it terrifies them more than any confrontation ever could. You are no longer their battery. You are your own sun. And that shift, from object to source, sends seismic waves through their fragile ecosystem. Because a self-sustaining you cannot be controlled. A peaceful you cannot be provoked. And a radiant you, shining without permission, forces them to sit alone in the dark they've created. No audience. No performance. Just the raw, unfiltered reality of a man or woman who never learned how to generate their own light. This turning point isn't just your liberation. It's their reckoning. For the first time, they must face the truth. They can mimic connection, but they cannot create it. They can perform devotion, but they cannot sustain it. And without someone to borrow energy from, without a willing empath to drain, they are nothing but static in the dark, a ghost haunting a body that never learned how to simply be human without needing to steal warmth from another soul. Now, observe the collapse, not with glee, but with clarity. Without your emotional energy to borrow, their charisma begins to dull like a bulb running on dying batteries. Their stories lose their spark. Their charm feels rehearsed, strained, even desperate. New targets sense the hunger beneath the polish, the subtle panic in their eyes when admiration isn't instant. Because authenticity can't be faked forever. And you were the last great illusion that held their facade together. Your withdrawal didn't just remove a person, it removed the final source of borrowed radiance. And now, their world is crumbling from the inside out, not with drama, but with silence. They'll cycle faster, jumping from empath to empath, conquest to conquest, chasing the high you once gave them. But it's never the same. Because you weren't just another source of supply. You were the one who saw glimpses of their humanity and still stayed, until you realized staying was self-annihilation. Now, they scramble, using the same lines, the same manufactured vulnerability, the same guilt-laced flattery. But the magic is gone. Because magic requires belief. And the world is starting to stop believing in them, one awakened empath at a time. Their social mask begins to slip in plain sight. Friends notice the pattern. The sudden devaluation after you set a boundary, the smear campaigns when you pull away, the way they discard people the moment they stop mirroring their grandiosity perfectly. Lovers sense the difference. The hunger is still there, but the energy is gone. The body can no longer keep up with the demands of the ego. And in that gap, the truth leaks out. They are not invincible. They are unraveling. And people are finally seeing the man or woman behind the myth, not as a charismatic enigma, but as a frightened human running on empty. Internally, they're in free fall. No amount of new supply silences the voice that now whispers louder than ever, "You're empty." The void you once temporarily masked with your calm, your presence, your unwavering light is now roaring. Because the void isn't about attention, it's about self. And they still have no answer to the question that haunts them every night when the lights go out and the performance ends: who am I when no one is watching? Who am I without someone to steal energy from? And that silence is unbearable. So they fill it with noise, but the noise only makes the emptiness louder. They'll rewrite history with surgical precision, claiming you were toxic, manipulative, or emotionally unstable. Not because it's true, but because your truth exposes their fraud. If they can destroy your credibility in the eyes of others, they can restore their illusion of superiority, if only for a little while longer. It's not about justice or truth. It's about survival. Because in their mind, if the world believes you were the problem, then they never have to face the devastating reality: they were never capable of real connection. They were only ever capable of consumption, and now, the feast is over. But truth is louder than their lies. Every survivor who walks away chips away at their facade. Every boundary you set becomes a crack in their armor. And slowly, the world stops feeding them, and starts seeing them. Not as the radiant leader they pretend to be, but as the emotionally stunted predator they've always been. Their supply dries up not because people are cruel, but because people are finally awake. And awakening is contagious. The more who see, the harder it becomes for the narcissist to find new believers for their tired, hollow act. Their collapse isn't dramatic. It's quiet. A slow, inevitable fade into irrelevance as people choose authenticity over performance, presence over intensity, and consistency over chaos. The market for their illusion dries up, because the truth is finally trending. And in the silence left behind, they are forced to sit with the one thing they've spent a lifetime running from, themselves. No audience. No borrowed light. Just the raw, unfiltered reality of their own darkness, with no one left to blame but the reflection in the mirror. They'll never understand why you left. Because in their narrative, they gave you everything: passion, attention, drama, devotion. But you didn't want their spectacle. You wanted safety. You wanted someone who could hold space without needing to drain you, someone whose presence didn't vanish the moment you asked for consistency or emotional honesty. They mistake volume for depth, urgency for commitment, and control for care. And because they cannot fathom real intimacy, they assume you were flawed for wanting it. But the flaw was never yours, it was theirs. Their tragedy is not yours to carry, to fix, or to mourn. Let them spiral in the silence they created. Let them face the mirror without your reflection, without your energy, without your belief in their performance. Because your freedom began the moment you stopped being the answer to their existential crisis. You were never responsible for filling their void, that was their work, not yours. You were only ever responsible for protecting your light, your peace, and your right to exist without being mined for their ego's survival. And as they search desperately for their next source, recycling your kindness, mimicking your calm, using your vulnerability as a blueprint for their next conquest, you're doing something radical, something revolutionary. You're rebuilding your emotional energy from within. Not for an audience. Not for validation. Not to prove anything to anyone. But because you finally, deeply believe, you are worth more than supply. Your empathy is not a weakness. Your boundaries are not walls. They are the sacred perimeter of a sanctuary only the worthy may enter. Here is the final, unshakable truth. Your emotional energy was never theirs to consume. It was always yours to protect, to honor, to share only with those who bring their own flame. The narcissist didn't admire your radiance. They mined it. And every time you gave your presence to soothe their emptiness, you dimmed your own soul. But that ends now. Because healing isn't about shining brighter for others, it's about refusing to let anyone extinguish your fire. Your energy is not a public utility. It's a sacred covenant with yourself. And from this day forward, it will only ever be shared with those who bring warmth, not hunger. Real love doesn't drain your energy. It reflects it. It doesn't demand you burn yourself to keep someone else warm. It builds its own fire and stands beside you, two flames glowing without consuming. That kind of love doesn't vanish when you set a boundary. It deepens. It doesn't punish you for needing rest. It honors it. And that love is waiting for you, not in chaos, but in calm. Not in extraction, but in exchange. You deserve relationships that add to your light, not subtract from it. And now that you know the difference between connection and consumption, you'll never confuse addiction for love again. Healing begins the moment you stop apologizing for protecting your energy. When you stop justifying your need for peace. When you realize that someone who treats your emotional presence as a resource will never treat your soul as a sanctuary. You weren't broken because they used you. You were brilliant because you survived, and wiser because you walked away. Your empathy is not a flaw. But giving it to those who weaponize it? That's self-abandonment. And you've stopped abandoning yourself to make addicts feel comfortable. You are not damaged goods. You are not too sensitive or too giving. You are a reclaimed sanctuary. Every boundary you set is a brick in the temple of your renewed self. Every no is an act of devotion to your own soul. Every moment of silence you choose over chaos is a declaration, my energy is sacred. Let them call you cold. What they really mean is, you're no longer feeding me. And that's not a flaw, it's your freedom, your sovereignty, your power. Let their hunger remain their prison. You are free to love someone who doesn't need to consume you to feel whole. Someone whose presence doesn't leave you emptier, but fuller, calmer, more yourself. Someone who doesn't see your empathy as a weakness to exploit, but as a strength to honor. You deserve a love that doesn't require you to disappear to make them feel seen. A love that grows in stillness, not chaos. A love that stays, even when the performance ends and the lights go out. Every time you choose yourself over their craving, you reclaim a piece of your stolen power. Every boundary is a resurrection. Every silence is a revolution. You are not selfish for protecting your energy, you are sovereign. And sovereignty terrifies narcissists more than any exposure ever could, because it exposes the lie they've sold the world, that they are powerful. In truth, they are powerless without their supply. But you? You are powerful with or without them. One day, you'll sit in a quiet room, and the thought of them won't stir a single ripple in your soul. Not because you've forgotten, but because you've forgiven yourself for ever believing you needed to give your energy to be worthy. You'll realize their rage was never about you, it was about their own terror of being ordinary. And your calm? That was never weakness, it was the quiet roar of a soul that finally came home to itself. In that stillness, you'll understand, you were never the victim. You were the victory. You were never the problem. You were the mirror that showed them their emptiness, and they broke the glass rather than face the truth. But you? You survived the shattering. And from those shards, you didn't just rebuild, you evolved. You transformed pain into clarity, betrayal into boundaries, confusion into conviction. You didn't lose yourself in them. You found yourself in the aftermath. And that self is stronger, wiser, and more radiant than they ever deserved to witness. Your future belongs to someone who doesn't just want your warmth, but protects your flame. Who doesn't just admire your resilience, but defends your peace. Who knows that love isn't taken through manipulation, control, or performance. It's given freely, and only when both souls are fully present, fully free, and fully respected. You will not be reduced to a function. You will not be valued only when you're giving. You will be cherished in your stillness, in your silence, in your ordinary moments, because real love doesn't need a show. It just needs you. The intimacy junkie may panic. They may beg. They may promise the moon. But none of it matters, because you've already left the stage. And from now on, your life isn't about their apologies, their validation, or their hunger. It's about your peace. Your joy. Your unshakable truth, you were always enough. You always will be. And no one, not even them, gets to decide that for you. Your emotional energy is not a bargaining chip. It is a covenant, with yourself. And from this day forward, it will only ever be shared with those who bring not hunger, but harmony. Not need, but nourishment. Not illusion, but truth. Because you are not here to feed ghosts. You are here to shine. Fully. Finally. Free.